Hello, my name's Joe Rukin and I've made this video about the proposed changes to Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Service, the resource to risk proposal that's under consultation, because we are told that it is absolutely not about closing fire stations and it's absolutely not about making cuts. It's just about changing working practices. And the reason that we know that it's not about closing fire stations is because it says in big letters on the Warwickshire County Council website that it is not about closing fire stations. Though the Fire and Rescue Service Association, one of the bodies that represents firefighters, have sent out two press releases during the consultation with exactly the same headline: Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Fire Station Closure Proposals. Because what is proposed is basically sleepwalking into the closure of 7 fire stations. And of course, the reason that Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Service and the bosses at Warwickshire County Council need to say that this isn't about closing fire stations is because they have a long and proud history of closing fire stations. At the tail end of the last century, Tyso and Kyneton went. Then 15 years ago, the then Fire Chief Officer, Graham Smith, actually said that closing 7 fire stations would save lives. But sadly for him, instead of closing 7 fire stations, they only got to close 3. And it's important to say that these changes aren't about cuts, because again, there were massive additional cuts about 10 years ago when they had to shave about £2.5 million off the budget, making firefighters redundant and changing to new working patterns. They also got rid of the Young Firefighters Association, and they wonder now why they've got recruitment problems. So with all this in the background, it's really important to say right from the start that the resource to risk plans are not about closing fire stations and they're not about saving money. It's just about changing working patterns, getting the right people to the right place at the right time. What Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Service are saying is they have too many fire appliances available at night and not enough during the day, whilst at the same time they're saying that they don't have enough available at night because of the availability of on-call firefighters, people who have other jobs during the day and are on call at night, because their availability is dropping off. So they want to just basically get rid of that working pattern and move on to this one. Yep. This is actually the slide that was presented to the Cabinet of Warwickshire County Council for their meeting on the 9th of November 2023. They signed off going to consultation when presented with a bar chart filled with question marks where the numbers should be. That's how half-assed this was right from the start. And it also gives you an idea of the level of attention to detail that you can expect from the Tory councillors who make up Warwickshire County Council cabinet. Anyway, by the time the consultation was launched, they had managed to add the numbers. And what you see here is they basically just want to get rid of on-call firefighters. And in their place, they want to bring in a couple of evening shifts and introduce these things called surge teams. Now, the consultation says that historic data shows that it's about 4 times every 5 years when there will be a large incident and they will need to roll these surge teams into operation. So under the proposals, there are 7 fire stations, 6 that are currently on call, 1 that is staffed, that will become surge team stations. So basically, Polesworth, Kenilworth, Henley in Arden, Gaydon, Bidford on Avon, Fenny Compton and Shipston on Stour fire stations all pretty much close under this proposal. Well, what's being said in the consultation is that, of course, they're not closing them, they're just changing the working patterns. And they just happen to be changing the working patterns from a pattern where people work there to a pattern where people don't work there. Basically, the plan is to turn these 7 fire stations into garages where they will keep a fire appliance, a fire engine, and some kit. And that doesn't technically count as closing them, does it? And part of the reason for telling you all this history at the start was to remind you that we've had a rolling series of cuts over the years. So when they turn these 7 fire stations into glorified lockups, what's going to happen when the next review happens in 3 years' time? Someone's going to look at this and say, well, we got these 7 fire stations, we're paying for their upkeep, but we're just using them as glorified lockups. And the land's got to be worth something, so why don't we just flog them off? And as for the surge teams themselves, there is no detail about them at all. This is the actual FAQ accompanying the consultation. And it asks, pretty straightforward questions. What are their hours? What are the wages, the shifts, the contracts? And the actual answer is, the service is currently working on a starting proposal to include more detail for an evening shift and surge shift. It will provide details on competence expectations, working hours, who can access these shifts, numbers of personnel required, and remuneration. So basically what they're saying is they have no details whatsoever. They've gone to public consultation, and not only do they not know how the surge teams will work, but they don't even know how the evening shifts will work and how much they'll get paid. But despite that, they're willing to go to consultation and absolutely state that the whole thing is going to cost $12,892,000 a year to run. That's a cost saving of 14 grand. But they don't know what the wages will be. Yeah, right. Oh, and while they want to get rid of all the on-call firefighters, they haven't included any costs for making up to 120 staff redundant, because they've just assumed that all the on-call firefighters will want to become evening shift part-time firefighters, and that they won't have to make any of them redundant, so there's no cost there. We also don't know how much taxpayers' money has been blown on the consultants who've come up with this rubbish, because, of course, that is commercially sensitive. And it's only after going to public consultation that they've started talking to the staff about these proposals, because they said, we didn't want to make it look like it was a done deal. Well, you could at least see if it was a doable deal, because currently there are 2 sets of firefighters in Warwickshire. You have the full-time and on-call. On-call, the what used to be called retained firefighters. They have a job, they get home at night, a home that has to be close to the fire station, and then they're on call. And this is where a lot of the evening cover and nighttime cover in Warwickshire comes from. Now, Chief Fire Officer Ben Brooks says it's basically impossible to get people to become on-call firefighters. This is a countrywide problem, and despite the fact that Hereford-Worcester, which neighbours onto Warwickshire, has 81% on-call availability, more than double what Warwickshire say they have. The idea is that Warwickshire, they've done everything they can, it's a lost cause, and we should just give up on-call altogether. And to demonstrate that, they have produced this graph showing the drop-off in on-call availability, and it looks bad. You'll see that from Warwickshire's point of view, the highest point of availability in the 2 years, 2021-2022, is 64.84%. The problem is that when you look at His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary's Fire and Rescue Services, they say in their latest report for 21-22 that average on-call availability was 67.5 in Warwickshire. So the Inspectorate is saying that the average for the year is higher than Warwickshire is saying that the absolute peak was. So I asked the Inspectorate if they could explain the difference in these figures, and they said that their numbers actually came from Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Services. They said, services provide the data to the Inspectorate. We ask for the overall percentage for all pumping appliances within the financial year. The difference you have observed may be due to a service using a different definition of what is available, or a slightly different calculation. So, the figures that Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Service have given to the Inspectorate are different to the figures that they're using in the consultation. And the figures that they're using in the consultation, when they say, on call, it's going down, it's really low, we might as well get rid of it, are lower than the figures that they've given to the Inspectorate. So someone here is lying. And it's either Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Service or it's Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Service, because these two numbers both have come from Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Service. And all right, they might not be lying, they might just be, using slightly different statistics, a different calculation. There are other figures in the consultation which are obviously wrong. They have this thing called the data information document, and in that there's a table. And the table in the left-hand column says that the average number of call-outs per station for 2021-2022. There have been freedom of information requests for the exact same data. And while it hasn't been released for 2021, it has been for 2022. So if we look at some of those 7 fire stations that are being closed or not being closed, depending on how you look at it, how politically opportune your language is, you'll see that with Gaydon, the consultation says that the 2-year average was 102. But the freedom information request says that the 2022 figure was 201. So for that average to be right, when we get the 2021 figures, it needs to be 3 for that average to work. For Kenilworth, the 2-year average is 80, but the FOI shows that the 2022 number was 165. Now, you don't have to be a mathematician to know that something ain't right here, because for that average to work, the Kenilworth station must have been called out -6 times in 2021. But it's not as bad as Fenny Compton, where the 2-year average was 18, but one of those 2 years was 52. So for that to be right, the 2021 figure has to be -16. And finally, bit of anticlimax here with Bidford-on-Avon, as a 2-year average is 47, and that is flanked by just 71 for 2022. So that average is mathematically possible. But the reason I wanted to put Bidford there was to give me an excuse to use the 2023 figure, which is 121. That in turn gives me an excuse to put all the 2023 figures for the other places too. And it seems when you do that it becomes very clear that there is an understating, shall we say, of the usefulness of the stations which they want to downgrade. Or just to repeat what I said before, someone here is lying, or at least using misleading statistics. And it's either Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Service or it's Warwickshire Fire and Rescue Service. Both sets of numbers are theirs, or at least the county council's. Now, the other thing driving these changes is the hangover from those £2.5 million worth of cuts 10 years ago. Because according to the Fire Brigades Union, those have never been reversed. Now, one of the things various fire services around the country did to get round similar cuts that happened at that point in time was to implement a series of 96-hour shift patterns, which are not illegal, they're just unlawful. Now, you heard that right. Not illegal, just unlawful. So that's not a criminal offence, just a civil one. And they vary, these shift patterns vary across the country. But here in Warwickshire, they have Day Crew Plus and Peak Demand Plus, where full-time firefighters do a 12-hour shift in the station, then 12 hours on call. Potentially 4 days running. So 96 hours. Not as bad as it used to be. It used to be 5 days, so used to be 120 hours. Now, to allow these shifts to happen, staff have to opt out of the protections of the Working Time Directive, and the Health and Safety Executive don't really seem to be bothered about any of this. But the word is that the FBU, the Fire Brigades Union, 6 years after the original ruling declaring the 96-hour shifts unlawful in South Yorkshire, are ready to push this nationwide. So all these shift patterns, which came into paper over the cracks of the massive cuts that were made about 10 years ago, look like they are going to be laid bare everywhere. Because finally, just like in 2009 when the fire chief was saying that closing fire stations was about saving lives, now in 2024, there's another fire chief saying that worsening response times is also about saving lives. With the added punchline here is that they say that the proposed changes are all about improving response times, but most of those response times actually go up. When you look at all these numbers for current and projected response times here together, there are 3 things that stand out. First off is if you are in rural South Warwickshire, served in Stratford District, you go from your current situation of being stuffed to a bright new future of being completely screwed. Secondly, while there are some slight improvements in the first response times, second response times fall away considerably, almost everywhere. But the third thing here is when you look at those second response times and you can see those numbers are really obviously made up, because there is no way that those individual district and borough numbers can possibly equate to that county-wide average. Now, just to hammer this home, because I know maths isn't everyone's thing, here's a graph, a bar chart. Now, the red one is meant to be the county-wide average. The blue ones are the bits that feed into that average. This is not how maths works. The only way that this can possibly work is if over 90% of all the calls for the whole county come from Rugby, and they don't. Rugby is the third busiest station in the county, Leamington is second, and Nuneaton is the busiest, though not under the new plans, because Nuneaton is set to lose one of its fire engines. Oh yeah, and just in case you were wondering, given that the idea in this plan is to slash overnight cover, I thought I'd ask what they reckon the new response times at night would be, put in a Freedom Information request. Their response was that they don't have the data. So they've worked all these averages without knowing what the components of those averages are. Again, that's not how maths works. I mean, this is primary school maths that is being failed here. So you've got until the 10th of March to respond to the consultation. Link is below. Good luck.